The morning Alara Cobb was thrown out of her aunt's house, the thermometer on the porch post read 11 degrees. She stood on the frozen dirt road in a coat 2 sizes too small, clutching a flour sack that held everything she owned in the world: a change of clothes, a comb with 3 missing teeth, and a dog-eared copy of the Practical Farmer's Almanac that had belonged to her father before the mine collapse took him and her mother both when she was 9. Aunt Mabel's voice still rang in her ears, sharp as the January wind cutting through the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in the winter of 1934. "I've had enough of you, girl. Enough of your questions. Enough of your reading. Enough of your ideas. You think you're better than the rest of us, and I won't have it under my roof for one more day." The door slammed. The bolt slid home. And just like that, 15-year-old Alara Cobb became no one's responsibility. It hadn't been stealing that got her cast out, or laziness, or any of the sins that might have earned a girl banishment in a hard mountain town like Harlan's Fork. It had been questions, endless, restless, unforgivable questions. Why did the creek dry up every August when it used to run year-round? Why did Mr. Pratt's well go deeper every year while the Sullivan Spring still flowed strong? Why did the old-timers say the mountain used to be greener, wetter, more generous with its water? And the question that had finally broken Aunt Mabel's patience, asked at a church supper in front of the town's most important men: why had the logging company been allowed to clear-cut the eastern ridge when anyone with sense could see it was killing the watershed? That question had embarrassed Harlan Briggs himself, the man whose family had founded the town and whose timber money kept half of it employed. Aunt Mabel had felt the weight of his displeasure the very next day when the small credit she ran at his general store was suddenly revoked. By the following morning, Alara was on the road. If you want to find out how a 15-year-old girl, thrown into the dead of winter with nothing but a book and a sack of clothes, ended up saving the very town that cast her out, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Alara Cobb built in those mountains didn't just save her life. It saved every life in Harlan's Fork, and it changed the way people in that entire valley thought about water forever. To understand what Alara did, you have to understand what she lost before that January morning, and you have to understand the town that lost her. Harlan's Fork sat in a narrow valley in the Blue Ridge, a town of perhaps 300 souls that clung to the mountainside the way lichen clings to rock, stubbornly, without much beauty, but with a grip that wouldn't let go. It was a timber town and a mining town, and by 1934, it was a dying town, though most people hadn't admitted it yet. The mines were playing out. The timber company had stripped the easy slopes and was pushing higher into the mountains for what remained. And the water, the lifeblood of any mountain community, was disappearing. Wells that had never gone dry were going dry. Springs that had fed families for generations were reduced to a trickle or had stopped flowing altogether. Every summer was harder than the last, and every winter the old people shook their heads and said they'd never seen the creek so low. Into this world, Alara Cobb had been born in 1919, the only child of Thomas and Ann Cobb. Her father had been a coal miner, yes, but he had also been a reader, an unusual man in Harlan's Fork, quiet and thoughtful, with hands blackened by the mine, but a mind that roamed far beyond it. On Sundays, while other men drank or slept or stared at nothing, Thomas Cobb sat on his porch with a book. He read agricultural journals. He read natural history. He read a battered copy of a government survey of Appalachian watersheds that he'd found at a church rummage sale. And he studied it the way other men studied scripture. He'd taught Alara to read before she was 5. More than that, he'd taught her to see. On walks through the woods, he'd stop and show her how water moved through rock, how tree roots held soil together like fingers holding earth in a fist, how a spring was born deep in the limestone bones of a mountain and traveled sometimes for miles through darkness before it broke into daylight. He taught her to press her palm flat against moss-covered stone and feel the cold seeping through. That was water, he said, moving beneath the surface, alive and purposeful, following paths carved over centuries. Her mother, Anne, had been Thomas's perfect complement. Where he understood the science of growing things, she understood the practice. Her kitchen garden produced more food per square foot than any plot in the county. She composted, rotated crops, and saved seeds with the care of a jeweler sorting gems, labeling each envelope in her neat hand. She taught Alara the patience of seeds, how you could hold an entire future in the palm of your hand if you knew what to do with it. How the tiniest seed contained a kind of faith, a promise that if you did your part, the earth would do the rest. When the mine collapsed in 1928, it took Thomas and Anne both, Thomas underground with 11 other men, and Anne in the rescue effort, crushed by a secondary collapse while trying to reach survivors. She had been passing water buckets in the chain, and when the tunnel mouth gave way a second time, she simply disappeared beneath the rock. They were buried together in the church cemetery, and 9-year-old Alara stood at the grave in a dress that was already too short for her and understood, with a clarity that no child should have to possess, that she was alone in the world. She went to Aunt Mabel, her mother's sister, a thin, sour woman of 50, who had never married and who viewed the world as a series of burdens to be endured rather than questions to be asked. Mabel took Alara in because the church expected it and because there was no one else. For 6 years, Alara endured. She worked hard, up before dawn to stoke the stove, scrubbing floors, cooking meals, hauling water from the well that seemed to drop lower every summer. She split kindling and mended fences without complaint. She earned her keep, and then some. But she could not stop her mind from working, and she could not stop her mouth from following where her mind led. She read everything she could find, every scrap of newspaper, every almanac, every tattered magazine. She borrowed books from the tiny lending shelf at the post office and returned them with questions the postmistress couldn't answer. She asked the old men on the store porch about the way things used to be, and she remembered what they said with a precision that sometimes unnerved them. She noticed things. That was her gift and her curse. She noticed that the town's water problems had gotten worse every year since the Briggs Timber Company started cutting the eastern ridge in 1930. She noticed the old springs failing while the creeks ran brown with mud after every hard rain, the topsoil washing away like blood from a wound. She noticed that the older folks' stories about the mountain, how green it used to be, how the springs never quit, described a place that was being systematically destroyed. She saw a pattern that no one else seemed willing to see, or at least willing to say out loud, because seeing it meant questioning the one man in town who still had money to spend. And when she said it out loud, at that church supper, in her clear, steady, 15-year-old voice, looking directly at Harlan Briggs, while she asked why his company's clear-cutting was draining the mountain's water, she sealed her fate. Briggs had gone red in the face. The room had gone silent. And Aunt Mabel had grabbed Alara's arm hard enough to leave bruises and dragged her home without a word. Alara walked north. She didn't have a destination, only a direction, away. The cold was a living thing that wrapped around her and squeezed. She walked through the morning and into the afternoon, following old logging roads that wound up into the higher elevations where the trees were still thick, where Briggs's saws hadn't reached yet. She ate snow and chewed on a strip of dried apple she found in the bottom of her sack. By late afternoon, her feet were numb and she was beginning to stumble. She might have died that night. She nearly did. But as the light began to fail, she came around a bend in the old road and saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Cut into the hillside was a stone structure, half hidden by laurel thickets and the accumulated debris of years. It looked like a root cellar, but larger, much larger. A heavy wooden door hung from one hinge, and beyond it, stone steps descended into the earth. Above the door, carved into the lintel stone in letters almost obscured by moss, were the words, Drennan Spring House, 1887. Alara had heard of the Drennans. Everyone in Harlan's Fork had. They'd been the first family in the valley, before even the Briggs clan. They'd farmed the high ground for 2 generations before a fever took the last of them in the 1890s. Their homestead had been abandoned for 40 years. She pushed through the broken door and descended the steps. What she found below changed everything. The spring house was built into the living rock of the mountain. It was a long, vaulted chamber, perhaps 60 feet deep and 20 feet wide, lined with cut stone that was still sound after nearly 50 years. And at the far end, emerging from a crack in the limestone wall, was water, clear, cold, steady water, flowing into a stone basin and then disappearing through a channel cut in the floor. The Drennan Spring, one of the old ones, the deep ones that the old-timers talked about, still flowing, still generous, even while every well and creek in the valley below was failing. The air in the spring house was warmer than outside, not warm, but above freezing. The constant temperature of the earth and the flowing water created a pocket of survivable air, even in the dead of January. Alara sank down on the stone floor beside the basin, drank deeply, and for the first time since that morning, allowed herself to cry. She slept that night on a bed of dry laurel leaves she gathered from outside, wrapped in her thin coat, curled beside the spring where the earth's warmth kept the air just above freezing. She woke stiff, hungry, and alive. Over the next 3 days, she explored the Drennan homestead. The house above was a ruin, collapsed roof, rotted floors, nothing salvageable. But the spring house was a fortress, and beyond it, she discovered something remarkable. The Drennans had built an entire water system into the mountainside. Stone-lined channels ran from the spring house outward in 3 directions, following the contours of the slope. There were remnants of what had been a gravity-fed irrigation network, stone aqueducts, settling pools, even a small reservoir carved into a natural hollow in the rock. It was all overgrown and partially collapsed, but the engineering was sound. The Drennans had understood water the way Alara's father had understood it, not as something you pumped and fought for, but as something you worked with, guided, and respected. Those first weeks were the hardest of Alara's life. She was cold constantly, a deep, bone-level cold that never fully left her, even beside the spring where the earth's warmth kept the air above freezing. She ate what she could find, winter-dried berries still clinging to frozen bushes, the inner bark of birch trees stripped and chewed until her jaw ached, a rabbit she managed to trap using a snare technique she'd read about in her almanac and practiced for 3 days before she got it right. The first time she killed the rabbit, she cried. The second time she didn't. Hunger had a way of clarifying things. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her ribs stood out like the rungs of a ladder. Her fingers cracked and bled from the cold and the constant work of gathering firewood and clearing stone. She developed a cough that lasted 3 weeks and left her so weak she could barely climb the steps from the spring house. There was a night in late January when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind found every crack in the old stone walls, and she huddled in the deepest corner of the spring house, shaking so violently she bit through her own lip, tasting blood, certain that she would not see morning. She thought of her parents. She thought of the warm kitchen and her mother's hands and the sound of her father reading aloud by the stove. She thought about giving up, about walking back down to Harlan's Fork and begging Aunt Mabel to take her back, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die on this mountain than live another day in that house where her questions were crimes and her curiosity was a disease to be beaten out of her. But morning came. It always came. The sun found the gap between the mountains and poured its pale winter light across the snow, and Alara rose stiffly from her bed of leaves and went to the spring and drank, and the water was cold and clean and alive, and she was alive too, and that was enough to start another day. With each morning, she learned something new. She learned which stones in the spring house wall stayed warmest, the ones closest to the spring, where the earth's constant temperature radiated through the rock like a slow, steady heartbeat. She learned how to bank a small fire at the entrance, so the smoke drew outward while the heat pooled inside, warming the chamber without filling it with choking haze. She learned to read the water, its flow, its temperature, its clarity, the way it responded to rain and snow melt above. When rain fell on the mountain, the spring ran slightly cloudy for a day and then cleared, and she understood that she was watching the mountain filter water through its own body, cleaning it, cooling it, delivering it, pure and steady from the deep places where rock and water had been in conversation for millennia. She began to see the mountain not as a hostile wilderness, but as a system, an interconnected web of water and stone and root and soil, each part depending on every other part, the whole thing as intricate and purposeful as the inside of a clock. And she began to understand, with growing clarity, what had gone wrong in the valley below. The trees were the key. The trees held the soil. The soil held the water. Remove the trees and the soil washed away, and without soil to hold it, water ran off the mountain in destructive floods instead of soaking in to feed the springs. The mountain's ability to store and release water, its most essential function, the thing that made life in the valley possible, had been destroyed by men who saw trees as lumber and nothing more. Spring came slowly to the high mountains, but when it came with water everywhere, snowmelt pouring down every slope, creeks roaring, the Drennan Spring swelling to twice its winter flow. Alara watched and measured and thought. She began clearing the old stone channels, pulling out decades of leaves and debris, resetting fallen stones. She worked with her hands and with sticks, and with flat rocks she used as shovels. It was brutally hard work for a girl who weighed barely 100 pounds, but she had her father's stubbornness and her mother's patience, and she had something else, a vision of what this place could become. It was in April of that first year that she met Silas Whitmore. Silas was 73 years old, a former stonemason who lived alone in a cabin 3 ridges over. He'd come up to check on a stand of ginseng he tended, and had followed the sound of Alara's work. Stone on stone, the unmistakable rhythm of someone building. He found a half-starved girl in a ragged coat, carefully fitting rocks into a channel wall with a precision that made him stop and watch for a full 10 minutes before he spoke. "You're setting those stones wrong," he said. Alara looked up. She was not afraid. She had been alone for 3 months and had forgotten how to be afraid of people. "Show me the right way then," she said. Silas Whitmore became the second great teacher of Alara's life. He taught her how to cut and fit stone properly, how to read the grain of rock and work with it instead of against it. He brought her food, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, and in return, she showed him what she was trying to do. She showed him the old Drennan water system, and she told him what she'd figured out, that the clear cutting on the eastern ridge had destroyed the forest's ability to hold water. Rain that once soaked slowly into the ground now ran off in sheets, carrying topsoil with it, draining the water table, killing the springs that fed the valley. The town's water crisis wasn't bad luck or drought. It was a wound, and it was man-made. My daddy used to say water has a memory, Alara told Silas. It remembers where it's supposed to go. You just have to help it remember. Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he took off his hat, set it on a rock, rolled up his sleeves, and started working. Together, over the spring and summer of 1934, they rebuilt the Drennan water system. But they didn't just restore it. They expanded it, using principles Alara had read about and ideas she'd developed through observation. They built a series of stone check dams across the small ravines above the spring house, creating pools that slowed runoff and allowed water to soak into the ground. They dug what Alara called soaking trenches, long, shallow ditches filled with gravel and covered with brush, positioned along the contour lines of the slope to catch rainwater and feed it slowly into the earth. They cleared and relined the old channels, extending them further down the mountain, creating a network that could collect, store, and distribute water across nearly 40 acres of mountainside. The most ambitious part was what Alara called the underground garden. She had noticed that the temperature inside the spring house remained constant, around 55 degrees year-round. She'd read about underground greenhouses in her almanac, and she'd seen how the Drennans had used their spring house for cold storage. She took it further. She and Silas expanded a natural shelf of rock near the spring into a long, south-facing trench, roofed it with salvaged glass from the ruined Drennan house and stones, and used the spring water to keep the temperature stable. By midsummer, she was growing lettuce, kale, and root vegetables underground, while the water system above fed a terraced garden that climbed the slope in neat stone-walled steps. Silas taught her stonework. She taught him to see water as a system rather than a commodity. They worked in companionable silence most days, the old man and the young girl, building something neither could have built alone. By the fall of 1934, Alara's water system was functioning. The terraced gardens had produced more food than she could eat, and she had dried and stored enough to last the winter. More importantly, the soaking trenches and check dams were working. She could see it in the way the small streams below her site flowed more steadily now, less prone to the flash and drought cycle that plagued the lower valley. She was recharging the water table, one stone dam at a time. Word of what she was doing filtered down the mountain slowly. A hunter passed through and saw the terraces. A woman gathering herbs stumbled onto the check dams and followed the channels to the spring house, where she found Alara reading by candlelight. Stories began to circulate in Harlan's Fork. Stories about the Cobb girl living wild on the mountain, building walls and digging ditches like a woman possessed. Most people dismissed her. A few were curious. One or two were hostile, Harlan Briggs among them, who didn't like the implication that his logging operation had anything to do with the town's worsening water problems, and who liked even less the idea that a 15-year-old girl he'd helped drive out was proving it. But the water didn't care about Harlan Briggs's feelings, and by the second year, the evidence was impossible to ignore. The springs below Alara's water system began to recover. Streams that had gone dry started flowing again. Farmers whose wells bordered the northern slope, the slope Alara's system fed, noticed their water tables rising while everyone else's continued to fall. When the drought of 1936 hit and Harlan's Fork's main well dropped to a trickle, the springs fed by Alara's mountainside kept running. People began to come up the mountain, not many at first. A farmer's wife who needed water for her children, a man whose livestock were dying of thirst. Alara gave water to everyone who came. She never asked where they were from or what they'd said about her. She showed them the system, explained how it worked, and offered to help them build something similar on their own land. Water doesn't hold grudges, she told a woman who couldn't meet her eyes out of shame. Neither do I. Silas Whitmore died in the winter of 1937, peacefully in his cabin, with a half-finished stone in his hand and a smile that suggested he'd been thinking of something that pleased him. He left Alara his tools, his cabin, and 40 acres of mountainside that adjoined the Drennan homestead. She buried him on the ridge where he'd like to sit and watch the sunset, and she marked his grave with the finest piece of stonework she'd ever done. A cairn of fitted stones that needed no mortar and would stand for 100 years. By 1940, Alara's water system had expanded from a single mountainside to a network spanning 7 ridges. She hadn't done it alone. Families who'd seen the results had started building their own check dams, soaking trenches and terraces, guided by Alara's knowledge and her willingness to walk any piece of land and read its water. She trained dozens of farmers in what she called water harvesting, techniques that worked with the mountain's natural hydrology instead of against it. She started a small nursery, growing the native trees and shrubs that held soil and fed springs, and she gave seedlings away to anyone who would plant them. The eastern ridge, scarred and barren from Briggs's clear-cutting, began to heal. Alara organized planting crews, women and children mostly, since the men were often away at work, and over 3 years, they replanted nearly 200 acres of stripped mountainside with oak, hickory, poplar, and laurel. It was slow work. It was unglamorous work, but it was the kind of work that changed everything beneath the surface, in the dark and quiet places where water moved through stone. In 1941, a crisis came that no one expected. A massive storm dumped 6 inches of rain on the valley in a single night. The bare slopes above Harlan's Fork, the ones that hadn't been treated with Alara's methods, sent walls of mud and water roaring into the town. 3 homes were destroyed. The main road was buried under 4 feet of debris. The town's well was contaminated with mud and was unusable. The slopes that Alara's system protected held. Her check dams caught the runoff. Her soaking trenches absorbed it. Her terraces channeled it safely. The contrast was so stark that even the most skeptical observer could see the difference between a mountainside that had been healed and one that had been stripped and abandoned. Harlan Briggs was 67 years old that year, and something in him broke when he stood in his flooded store, mud up to his ankles, and looked up at the mountain and saw the line, clear as a drawn border, between the slopes that had failed and the slopes that held. On one side, devastation, gullies torn open, roads buried, the raw red earth exposed like a wound. On the other side, Alara's side, the forest stood quiet and intact, the terraces holding, the water moving through its appointed channels, controlled and purposeful. It was the most eloquent argument anyone had ever made, and it was made entirely without words. Briggs walked up the mountain the next morning, for the first time in 7 years. It was a long walk for a man his age, and he stopped often to rest. Each time he stopped, he saw more evidence of what Alara had built. The check dams in the ravines, green with moss now, holding their pools of clear water. The soaking trenches, invisible from a distance but evident up close as lines of deeper growth along the contours. The young trees she'd planted, 5 and 6 feet tall now, their roots reaching deep into soil that her terraces had kept from washing away. He found Alara in her terraced garden, transplanting seedlings into the spring-fed beds. She was 22 now, lean and strong, with her father's steady eyes and her mother's patient hands. "I owe you an apology," Briggs said. His voice was rough with something he wasn't accustomed to feeling. "I owe this whole town an apology." Alara straightened up. She looked at the old man who had set in motion the night that nearly killed her, whose displeasure had cost her her home, whose pride had kept an entire town from seeing what was happening to their mountain. And she felt many things, but bitterness was not among them. She had spent too many years listening to water to hold on to bitterness. Water didn't hold on to anything. It moved. It found a way. It did its work and moved on. "I don't need an apology, Mr. Briggs," she said. "I need seedlings, 2,000 of them, oak and hickory, for the South Ridge, and I need your logging crews to help plant them." He stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. The planting of the South Ridge became the largest community effort in Harlan's Fork's history. Briggs paid for the seedlings and provided the crews. Alara designed the planting scheme, incorporating her water harvesting techniques into every acre. The entire town turned out on planting days, and for the first time in a generation, the people of Harlan's Fork worked together on something that would outlast all of them. Alara married Daniel Marsh in 1943, a quiet, capable man who had been one of the first farmers to adopt her water methods and who loved her with the steadiness of a deep spring. They had 3 children, all of whom grew up understanding water the way most children understood the alphabet. They expanded the system, documented it, and taught it to anyone who wanted to learn. By 1960, the Harlan's Fork Watershed Project covered over 3,000 acres and had become a model for mountain communities across Appalachia. Agricultural agents came to study Alara's methods. Universities sent students. The techniques she'd developed, part inherited wisdom, part book learning, part pure observation, were decades ahead of what would later be called permaculture and watershed restoration. Alara Cobb Marsh died in the spring of 1997 at the age of 78 in the cabin that Silas Whitmore had left her, within earshot of the Drennan Spring that still flowed clear and strong after more than a century. Her children and grandchildren continued her work. The watershed project she founded still operates today, maintained by a trust she established, and by the descendants of the very families who once cast her out. The town of Harlan's Fork erected a stone marker at the entrance to the watershed trail. It bears her name, and a single line she was known to say when people asked how a 15-year-old girl had known what to do. "I didn't know what to do. I just asked questions until the mountain told me." Here's what I think about when I think about Alara Cobb's story. I think about the fact that every quality that got her thrown out, her curiosity, her refusal to stay silent, her insistence on asking why, was the exact same quality that saved an entire community. I think about how the people who punished her for seeing the truth were the same people who eventually needed her to show them that truth. And I think about how she responded to years of rejection, not with anger or revenge, but with water, with growing things, with the patient, quiet work of healing a mountain one stone at a time. What questions are you not asking because you're afraid of the answer? What truth are you sitting on because the people around you don't want to hear it? Alara Cobb was 15 years old, alone, and starving in a stone room on a frozen mountain, and she still didn't stop asking. She asked the water where it wanted to go. She asked the stone how it wanted to be laid. She asked the mountain what it needed to heal. And the mountain answered her. Sometimes the thing that makes you unwelcome is the very thing the world is waiting for. Sometimes the question nobody wants you to ask is the one everybody needs to hear. Alara didn't set out to save Harlan's fork. She set out to survive. But survival, for someone like her, meant understanding. And understanding meant asking. And asking meant eventually finding answers that were too important to keep to herself. She was thrown out for asking too many questions. She answered every single one of them with her life. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the questions you've been holding back, or the truths you've been afraid to speak, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a curious mind, and sometimes it's the only thing that can save us.